Hello, all you world changers out there studying for your NCE CPCE exams. My name is Coach Jeremy here for some little podcast information to pass along to you. And today, whenever you're listening to this, we're going to go over Freud and the psychoanalytic. Um, Again, for those of you who are curious where this is coming from, Hellwig. So check that out. But of course, sometimes hearing it through audio is a little bit better, all depending on how your learning capabilities are. So again, starting with the psychoanalytic theory versus psychodynamic. Psychoanalytic theory is based on Freud's psychoanalytic theories. Longer, more intensive, talk therapy, more commonly used. Psychodynamic therapy focuses on the relationship between conscious and unconscious motivations. Briefer and less intensive interpersonal theory and person-centered therapy are types of this theory. And so I always tell students that I work with that the first thing about Freud, before we go into anything, is understanding that unconscious to conscious, and Freud is a little different than everybody, starting with the id, the ID, the ego, and the superego. That id is that devil, and that superego is that good angel, kind of like when you remember when you were a little kid and you hear that good cop, bad cop. And of course, the ego is the one that's basically in control and driving everything the way it should go. I always tell students also the other thing about Freud we got to know is the psychosexual stages of development: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Kind of the thing about this that you want to be aware of is when it comes to these stages, that power one that we talk about is the phallic stage. And there's always those two terms: the mother to son relationship, the Oedipus complex; the father to daughter relationship, the Electra complex. That is Freud. And of course, with Freud, we have, and I always tell people this, we've got the defense mechanisms. Those are not going anywhere. And I always also try to emphasize the importance of transference versus countertransference, because, of course, that is something that we could see on the exam, both in the ethics standpoint as well as in the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, and helping relations standpoint. So, when you're dealing with the transferencing, I always think the client first when you feel, that towards the counselor. So, in other words, the counselor could remind you, if you're the client, of the way that a relative talks to you, a former lover talks to you, a former employer or boss talks to you, where, of course, the counter, flip it. That's now the counselor's feeling that on the other end from the client. And then, of course, the defense mechanisms. And again, I always tell people first, let's kind of look at the more basic ones. Some of them are in the name itself. So, in other words, the denial, the flat out refusal. A lot of times it's in substance abuse. I don't have a problem. Again, you may be lying, but you're aware that you're lying, conscious. And then, of course, the regression, because whenever you regress in life, you're going backwards. So when you're regressing in defense mechanisms, when faced with distress, you're moving backwards in time, in psychological time. So an 80-year-old would take off his shirt and run on the beach like a 20-year-old. A 40-year-old would play video games like a 16-year-old, and a 16-year-old could wear diapers like a 6-month-old. So again, whatever you are doing, wherever you are in life, you're acting backwards, acting younger. Repression and suppression, two that I always like to talk about together. And again, repression is when memories are pushed back out of awareness automatically and subconsciously. Again, that's the key. So you're not making that choice to push those memories backwards and out of the picture. They're kind of just drifting away. And a lot of times that could be due to a severe witness to a an act of violence or act of something severe that just was so dramatizing to you that when it comes into fruition that it just wipes clear. Where suppression, memories consciously pushed out of awareness. So again, that's more like the denial where you're making the choice consciously. Others to think about: projection involves individuals attributing their own unacceptable thoughts and feelings and motives to another person. So again, I'm projecting my own feelings towards somebody else. Oftentimes, if I want to dislike somebody, thinking that they dislike me is going to make it seem more acceptable. Others, displacement and sublimation. Always like to talk about those two together. Displacement, satisfying an impulse with a substitute object, generally in a socially unacceptable, inappropriate way. So in other words, had a bad day at work, boss was very critical of me, yelling at me, and to vent out my frustrations, I go home and I take my cat and I launch it across the kitchen into the refrigerator. Again, if I do that to the boss, prosecuted and, lose unemployed, cat's not exactly going to call the police on me. So again, that is displacement. Sublimation is when we satisfy that impulse with a substitute object, generally in a social acceptable way. So in this case, I can think of a few examples. My favorite example, I don't know for any of you true crime fans or court TV fans, but Nancy Grace, if you ever watch her, very, very emotional, very behind her work, not afraid to speak her mind. And all that, turmoil, all that energy comes from the fact that she was going to college to become an English teacher until her fiance was shot to death. And it was at that time that she flipped careers and went to law school to be a prosecuting attorney to fight crime. And you could see her in the courtroom channeling that horrific moment in time in a positive manner. Again, could also be, instead of that person who got yelled at work, going to the gym and beating up a punching bag and lifting weights. Again, you're doing it in generally a socially acceptable way. Also, reaction formation, one of my favorite ones. I like this one. It's acting like you hate someone that you really have a crush on. You're displaying the opposite of how you feel. And, I always think that, usually in sixth grade, and again, I know with Freud, we probably don't want to, use kid examples, but typically when people have crushes on people, they usually are mean to them. So again, you're displaying the opposite of how you feel. So if I love you, I'm going to punch you in the face. If I hate you, I'm going to shower you with bliss, flowers, chocolates. You get the idea. So there you go. A little bit of defense mechanisms. Again, there are others. I think those ones are kind of the heavy hitters when it comes to Freud. And and I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention this again, information coming from Hellwig. And in Hellwig, in the psychodynamic psychoanalytic section, there's also the neo-Freudians. Again, these are people who were Freud followers that moved away from Freud's emphasis on the id as a dominant psychological force and placed more emphasis on the ego. And there's three people with three philosophies. Karen Horney, she has this idea that security is each person's major motivation, and a person becomes anxious when that is not achieved. So, in other words, if you are living in a bad part of town and your security system isn't working, your locks don't work on your door, and that's what your life is, you're out of whack. It's not good. Not good. You're going to be anxious. You're going to be stressed. It's not going to be working out too well for you. Again, security. If we don't have it, we got problems. Eric Fromm. This is the idea that individuals must join with others to develop self-fulfillment. So here is this approach that it goes against the individualistic view. So in other words, being productive means joining with others to be fulfilled. So being in our rooms playing video games, that doesn't cut it. No, to live our potential, we gotta mingle with the group. Get out there. That is Eric Fromm's point of view. Now, Harry Stack Sullivan, it's a social systems interpersonal approach that can lead to understanding human behavior, meaning that the best way we can analyze and understand human behavior is to observe someone when they're interacting with others. So going back to what I said before about Eric Fromm, being in your room playing video games by yourself, that, watching somebody behave, we can't analyze that. Not if they're by themselves. We got to put them with the group. How do they act? Are they rude? Are they polite? Are they socially awkward? We can't tell unless we put them with a group, not playing video games by themselves. So those are the neo-Freudians. So again, a little recap. We went over the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, and with the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic, we deal with things like the id, ego, superego, with the id being the devil, the superego being the angel, and the ego kind of directing traffic. We talked about the psychosexual stages of development, oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital, and that power stage that you got to know. And that is the idea that the Oedipus and the Electra complex. Oedipus, mother to son, Electra, father to daughter. And then, of course, we talked about defense mechanisms, repression, denial, projection, displacement, regression, sublimation, and how we deal with things in either an conscious or a subconscious matter when faced with distress. Again, Freud, different than other people. But again, he is not going anywhere. It is not going anywhere. And we got to know that when it comes to this part of the exam in the helping relations section. So again, Hellwig, that is where this material is coming from. And again, there's plenty out there when it comes to videos, when it comes to pictures. So however you can get that information kind of stuck within you, that'll help you on your exam. Good luck. This is Coach Jeremy from World Changers signing off.